Hello, welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast. I'm Justin Sloan.
And I'm Paul Zeidman, and I'm very happy to introduce our special guest. She is also known as the Geek with Gray Hair, an intellectual property and fandom growth expert, and she's going to be able to explain exactly what that is supposed to mean. Jenny Stiven, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure.
I'm excited for some geekiness coming.
that I got going on. No worries.
Excellent.
Awesome. So we always start off with like, what have we been listening to or reading or watching or what have you? And I'll just say I've been gaming hardcore this last week and a half. I've been trying to get into a better sleep pattern because I found a weird health reason. So I was like, I gotta start sleeping. So I'm trying to get more into sleep. So what I do is instead of my normal routine of trying to work my butt off all the time, I'm trying to relax a little bit. And so gaming has been my way to try to get into that a little bit more because it's part of my job anyway. So yeah, I started playing Prey, which is a not so recent game, but one that got a lot of acclaim. And I see why. It's a lot of fun. It's pretty cool. You start off as this sister to this other person in kind of a futuristic, what is it, San Francisco or New York? I forget. But anyway, futuristic world, and you're going through these experiments, and then there's twists and turns throughout the whole journey, and this alien species that mimics things around you. And I won't give anything away, but I'll just say it's a pretty cool game.
Yeah.
Have you played it, Jenny? Or heard of it?
Yes, I have actually played a couple of years ago, not recently, but I loved it. Mainly, it had a female protagonist, which was super cool for me. That doesn't happen all the time. I'm still old school. I play Tomb Raider still a lot, but as far as gaming is concerned, I've been playing FIFA recently a lot, and then tabletop gaming. We've got a weekly that we do. So we've got a Stargate RPG that we've been doing, which is fun. But watching, I'm all about Ahsoka right now. So I was rewatched all of Star Wars Rebels and then Ahsoka, and then reading. I'm reading S.G. Blaze's The Last Luminian series. It's like it's a sci-fi fantasy series.
Cool. Wow, you've been busy.
Well, I like to read at night before I go to bed. So that's where I get caught up in my reading.
Got it. I've been on a bit of an animation kick lately. So I just started getting into Adventure Time, which I'm sure a lot of people are like, oh, only now. So I just about finished with the first season. And I when I started it, I did not realize there are 10 seasons to it. So I'm in no rush to get through it. And I've told a lot of people this, and they say, oh, it gets better as it goes along.
Oh, it does.
I enjoyed the first season, but they keep saying like it'll gradually keep improving. And I'm like,
and it gets deep. It gets super deep. We started with my son, and so he grew through the years with it, and we got hooked. It gets deep.
Oh, well, I'm looking forward to the deepness developing. And another show I really enjoyed, this probably tie into what we're going to be talking about today, a show I'd heard a lot of good things about on Disney Plus, and they just canceled it after 3 years, called The Owl House. And I haven't heard of it. Oh, really? It's an animated show. It's a lot of magic. It's like a really major twist on kind of like Harry Potter. This girl from the human realm enters the demon realm, and she wants to learn how to be a witch. And it's just charming. And I gotta say, the writing is really good. And it's a lot of character development. And what's really impressive is that they're not one-off episodes. It's like almost the opposite of Adventure Time, that it's all one story. Okay. And in each episode, they plant things and set them up and then pay them off somewhere down the line. And so something that happens in like episode 2, there'll be a callback to that in like the second to last episode or the finale. Oh, cool. And there were 2 full seasons. And then I guess Disney decided they didn't want to make it anymore. So they were able to do 3 specials as a third season, like 3 45-minute or 2 45-minute and then 1 55-minute finale. And I'm really enjoying it. I think it's a lot of fun. And it's
I gotta check it out, man.
Yeah, and it's a lot. It's geared towards a younger audience, but sometimes a lot of the jokes will not hit for kids. A lot of adults will probably get the jokes. Like one girl says, "Now I'm only scarred externally," so or something like that.
I love it. That's good writing.
Yeah, so jokes like that, and I highly recommend it. So, okay, so Jenny, tell us a little bit about yourself. That you as we've been discussing, you're really into sci-fi and fantasy, but you work with IP and creators now, but you were not always that wasn't always your specialty.
No, I started out in TV production, and fell into digital fairly early. I mean, this is going to date me, but geek with gray hair kind of clues you in. 1992, 93 is when I really fell into online, and I was really lucky. We started a company, and I still continued to do production online, and then really got into agency and studio side work because entertainment was obviously where I'd been. And I've always been a geek. Grew up a geek. I was really lucky. I had a mom and a dad who were geeks. So, you know, both DC, Marvel, others, you know, it was all over the place. And when I got into the studio side, nobody at that time gave a, you know what, about geek properties or old sci-fi or new. And so they would throw out who wants to do the digital content, the digital production. I'll do it. Nobody else does. And that's how I fell into it, literally. And so from 1998 until 2015, that's all I did was digital marketing, digital production, digital creation. So all of the digital content for different sci-fi and geek properties. And what it ended up doing was honing my already, as a geek fan myself, perception of how fandoms were handled by studios, by production companies, not necessarily by the IP creators, but by the IP owners. And I differentiate very clearly between those two. You will have an IP creator who is not always the owner or the distributor of that property. And the distributors are the ones that usually handle the marketing, the content, the outreach. And a lot of times really don't understand the fandom. And they assign it to managers or brand managers or teams or agencies who really want the project, really want the title, but it's unlikely that you're going to have a dedicated person who understands that fandom and that title and that content deeply, unless you're at Lucasfilm. There's very few areas that do that kind of dedication. And so I realized that's what I wanted to do. And so what I do is I work with IP creators, I work with the owners, and I work with fandoms to make sure that that audience development happens the right way, that the content that is being written and directed for fandom is appropriate to the canon, that it's understood. And then I have dedicated community managers who love that project, love that property, so that they're speaking with and spending time with the fandom, not talking at them.
Mm-hmm. How do you, that makes a great question. How do you find the people to do additional work on an IP project? Because I was looking over the list and it's quite extensive, like, you know, going through here, you know, Star Wars, Aliens, Star Trek, Stargate, James Bond. Like, where do you find the contributors for that?
Early on, it was a lot easier. And that's a great question, because I don't always get asked that question, because I think nowadays we are online enough that you can find your fandom, whether it's on Reddit or AOT or whatever it is that you're going to, you can find your fandoms fairly quickly. But in the early days, it was a lot harder. It was very difficult. You had to do a lot more legwork, but it also was easier in the sense that once you found them, they were so excited and so happy that you were willing to spend time, that you could get a dedicated ambassador group, teams that would be diehard. I've got people that I worked with on Bond, Star Wars, Buffy, and Stargate that I'm still working with today, because that's how dedicated they were. But it is a lot of legwork, just like anything. It's do your research. And then this is the one that I always say, you got to go where the fans are. So it's not just online. It's get out of the seat, get out of the house, get out of your office, go to an event, go and look online about where the meetups are, introduce yourself, spend the time with fans, and then go meet them. And that's probably the most important. And I've developed teams in cities around the world that then go and meet fans so that they can make sure that the fans know that we are not just throwing them a bone, mm-hmm. or pretending that we understand what the canon is.
Oh yeah, actually, because that is something you mentioned about your background, that they were looking for someone to start working with these properties. And I guess, you know, the two of you were discussing before we started about going to Comic-Con, and a lot of outsiders who see Comic-Con, oh, it's just a bunch of nerds, and, you know, they like to play dress up. And so I was wondering, I may get them mixed up again. So the owners of the IP, not the creators, the owners, I'm assuming they did not like look at the properties with like, oh, this is just, a bunch of nerds are going to like this. We just need someone else to deal with it. I mean, how careful were they with selecting, how the properties were presented, or did that fall under your responsibilities?
That fell under my responsibility. So at a lot of studios, the way it was early on, and it's solidified into an infrastructure now, which is the challenge now, which is that it's very hard for fans to get through the infrastructure at an IP owner studio or production company to really understand what the creator wanted. So you have someone like Ryan Murphy who doesn't do that. So for instance, he's currently fighting to make sure that he is part of all marketing, all content, all production, so that when those conversations are happening with fans, it's accurate, as opposed to Netflix or someone else presuming that they understand. And so my job was to work with what was called, I'm sure you guys know, brand managers, people who were in charge of that IP, but to get past them to the creator. So it was to talk with Eon, who creates James Bond. It was to talk with James Cameron. It was to talk with Lucasfilm. I was lucky enough to go up and have several meetings with them where I got to actually talk to creators, to talk with Dark Horse, to talk with Boom Comics. You need to make sure that you're meeting those artists, those creators, the authors, that you understand why they created what they did. When you sit down and you talk to some of the creators, it's a completely different insight. As I'm sure you guys know, as authors and as the creative writing life, you've talked to a lot of authors. It's radically different than what the publisher or the PR or the publicist or the marketer is presenting. And you need to make sure that you get to that, because the fans aren't stupid. The fans are pretty quick to get it. And especially being online, a lot of the fans do their research. I'm not talking about the trolls, but I'm talking about the people who are dedicated fans. They do their research. So if you come across as presuming something or being flip about the canon or the content, then you've failed your job. And so that was my responsibility. And it's agencies who do this on a regular basis and they're dedicated to this do a great job. The problem is that they don't always have somebody that's dedicated to that particular content, because you can't afford it. You can't afford to have a community manager dedicated to every single solitary campaign that you're doing or IP. So that's where we come in.
Okay. So I have one more question, and I'll toss it over to Justin. So, these are beloved properties, no matter which one you're talking about. The people love them. They write their fan fiction. But what if they want to try and take it a little further? I mean, I've heard so many stories like, oh, I wrote a fantastic Spider-Man script, but I just can't get into Marvel. So I mean, is trying to approach it from, I guess, approaching you or approaching someone on your team, say, I would love for this to, I have this story, and I think it'd be great for, Lucasfilm, but I know I can't deal with their lawyers and that sort of thing.
Right.
Is that something they can approach you by, or is that like, are they wasting their time? Is there some kind of, is there a strategic way to approach it?
I think there's a strategic way. I have a lot of people approach me about it. And currently I'm completely independent consulting, but just 2 years ago, I was also full-time consulting for MGM and for Amazon. So I have to be very clear with people who approach me about, we wanted to do RoboCop, or we want to do something with this property, Stargate. I have to be very clear. Look, here are the challenges to that, not obstacles, but here are the challenges. They're not going to take an unsolicited script. They're not going to take an unsolicited idea. However, here are agencies who do that for a living that you can go to. They're not lawyers. They're not PR. This is what they do. And you can approach them because they already have a license for this property. So what I always tell people is, go do your research about who has a license for that IP. So whether or not it's Star Wars, or it's Stargate, or it's Buffy, or it's something, 2 new ones that I'm doing right now, see who they're licensing their IP to, and then go approach that licensee, because they're usually pretty willing to do something with you. And a perfect example is Wyvern Gaming has a tabletop RPG for Stargate. And I had some friends I had worked with them for 20 years on Stargate. They had some great ideas. And I said, look, it's not going to happen, especially with the scale going on right now. Just don't. But if you go to Wyvern, you might be able to sell it as an episode in their RPG, which is what they did. And that's what they got to do. So there's always ways to do it strategically. To your point, I a lot of people who write fanfic are super happy to keep it as fanfic and to be in that space. Fantastic. If you want to go beyond that, I'm always happy to talk to people, but that's the advice I'm going to always give.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Justin.
Yeah, I want to go back a step and look at you and how you got into this. Like, so it sounds like a really cool career, lots of fun, you know, leaning into that stuff that so many of us love. Yeah, what were those early steps? And did you see this as a trajectory, or did you kind of just stumble into it one day?
No way. I mean, part of the thing in production is when you start in production, it doesn't matter whether it was when I started or now. There's this huge spectrum of what production means about whether or not do you want film or television? Do you want to write? Do you want to direct? Do you want to produce? Do you want to do editing? Do you want to do post? Do you want to be in a supplemental industry? I mean, that is the beauty of the entertainment industry and production. The one thing I knew, and I knew from a super early age, is that I wanted to produce. I wanted to be involved in producing. I knew that super early. When I went to school for it, and then in my internships, I ended up following, and I was very lucky to have a woman mentor. She was running a documentary company, and originally that's what I wanted to do, was do documentaries. I had a major in history as well, and that's what I wanted to do. In fact, the other thing I'm watching is this YouTube channel, which I wish I knew the name, that is a narration of first-person eyewitness accounts of historical moments. It's hilarious, but sorry, tangent. The beauty of what I got to do was because I was curious. So I ended up at Mark Goodson Productions, which was game shows. And I was writing for Family Feud, and I was doing research for this woman who I'd followed over for her documentary company. And I'm walking past the art director's room, who I'd gotten to be very close to because I would ask questions. And, you know, I'm a 22-year-old. Hey, what are you doing? And he was on Video Toaster, which was the first round of Avid technology. And he sat me down and he taught me what he knew. And I was hooked. And I said, well, how'd you find this? And he shows me Prodigy and CompuServe. And I went and got a Mac, and I was hooked. And 2 years later, we left to create an online company. And then it kind of got away a little bit from entertainment. And I knew I wanted to get back to entertainment. So I looked for agencies, because at that time in the late 90s, agencies were starting to do work in digital production and digital content. And so I ended up doing some of the first websites for Mist, for Midway, for Namco. I got to do their first Gran Torino. Just a whole bunch of really cool things in gaming, which I was gaming anyway, so that was cool. And then it really honestly followed from there because I was curious. So everybody teases me about this. I have like a 3 to 5 year tap out where, okay, I want to go do something else. And it's always in digital, but okay, this is what I've done, moving on. So in 2015, by that time I'd worked with Fox, with Sony, with agencies. So I'd worked both client and agency side. And that's when I really discovered, I don't think the fans are being served. I don't think we're spending the time. In production, there's this thing called windowing. And even though we have so much streaming, you still see this. So the perfect example is Ahsoka. So Ahsoka started 6 months ago, tease, events, make sure people have seen Rebels, make sure people have read certain books. If they haven't, here are some basically catch up. Here's recaps. But once Ahsoka's over, you're done. It falls off a cliff. They don't care. They don't follow up. They don't make the effort. They don't continue. There are books that are being published in the next year that are going to reference what's happened in Ahsoka. And there'll be like this short window, but there's no connection. There's no bridge between these. And that's where I finally decided in 2015, okay, that's what I have to focus on. And I love it because I'm a fan myself. And so I know what to ask fans. Are you being served? And I don't mean fan service. I mean, are you being taken care of? Are you being communicated with? And is your community being, and I don't mean individually, but is the community being communicated with by these IP owners or distributors? And then I just love what I get to do. I mean, I get to pick projects. I get sci-fi fantasy authors who want me to start with their IP from the very beginning. We're pitching right now, well, not right now, it's on hold, but we're pitching to adapt. So that's why I was so excited to listen to your Jonathan Franzen I'm so sorry, I don't know how to pronounce his last name.
Yanez?
Yes. And what his journey was, because it's the journey I'm taking this author through right now. It's just a blast.
Yeah, so on that sense, like independent authors have a much smaller budget than the studios, of course. Are you working with people like that? It sounds like the answer is yes. Question mark.
I work now, it's funny, I work with a lot of independent authors now because it was pretty much of a natural progression, as you would assume. I work with comic book authors, and I worked with them a lot at the studios because part of what I was beating the drum about, and there were some very key people at Fox and MGM who felt the same way I did, and we were a pretty tight group, that you have to be cross-functional on how you're reaching your fans. It can't just be that you're making some extra content digitally, or that you're getting some really cool interactive pieces out to the fans about the storyline or the characters or the world building. You have to actually go and talk to the people who are creating the supplemental things. So audiobooks, authors, comic book authors, artists, what are they doing about this IP? So from that, I met this whole community of authors, and that was in mid 2000s, and it's been a blast. I love working with authors from the beginning. That's one of the things that I was lucky enough to do when nobody cared about sci-fi properties, is that I got to work from the very beginning of the scripts or the book or the idea, the concepting, and then you get to carry it through the whole process, the whole journey. And what I keep telling my authors right now is that journey just never ends, especially for authors. Whether you continue that series or move on to another series, your relationship with your fans continues. So how are you communicating with them? How are you working with them? And that's the journey that I take them on.
I imagine you have a lot of interest from, and maybe interest in, all this transmedia stuff going on lately, such as there's a lot of sci-fi properties that are trying to build out games while also approaching the novels and the comics. One that I'm working for at the moment as well. So what would be like your role in that whole thing? If they wanted to approach you and be like, hey, we'd love to think more big picture, more digital marketing, more all this strategy, where would be your starting point on that? And what's kind of your, here's what I can bring to the table?
Strategically what I do, and then execution, I have a team. So I've got a network of people that I work with depending upon what the IP is. So I have, I don't know, 40 to 60 people that I work with across the board that you've just gotten to know. And if someone comes to me, I sit down and I find out what have they already got, what's already been done. Maybe it's just the book. Maybe it's a book and they've got an idea, or they've already talked to tabletop gamers. But we look at the content first, and then where's your audience? And then you look at, and you have to really push authors on this, is where do you want to grow to? I thought Jonathan's answers were amazing when he was saying, I saw what I wanted to do, and it'd be a really challenge to do what Michael Crichton did, and I want to do that. And that's what you have to push authors to look at, or any IP conceptor and creator, is where do you want to take this story, this narrative, this world building? And what's exciting for me is I sit them down and I challenge them on that. We go through discovery process of exactly what I just said. Where's your current audience? What is your content? And then we look at, and I bring in experts in each of the different supplemental fields in the transmedia areas. What do we think the content fits the best? So one of the authors I'm working with right now, supplemental comic books or graphic novels fit best for her first, and then tabletop gaming. Video game would certainly be interesting for her content because it's extremely interactive, but it's very complicated. So a D&D or a tabletop RPG would be much better for this. And that's what you have to look at. And you bring in the experts to talk with those authors and those IP creators to say, okay, here's where I think it would be amazing. We should develop a series. We should develop a web series. We should do a game or books. A lot of the easiest things to start with are merch. I hate to say it, but it's merch. It is, and when I say that, I mean things like the author I'm working with right now, creating character cards, creating, in essence, the beginning of a tabletop game or the beginning of a graphic novel, where we're giving digital art away of the characters that we've had created by a friend of ours that worked at Dark Horse for her. And so that's what we did. That's strategic what we do. Then executionally, you have to go to your audience and you say, here's what we're starting with. We think these are really cool. We're going to give them to you for free. What do you think? And then you get that feedback from your audience. There's always an existing audience to talk to.
Yeah. Really cool. Yeah. And so I wanted to talk about some of the events that you've been doing lately. Like you mentioned Comic-Con before we hopped on. You just got back from Dragon Con. And so these kind of events, what are you often doing there? Are you putting on some of these exhibits related to properties that you're representing, or
yes, and
whatever
it depends.
Advising for?
Yeah, well, consulting for, right?
Consulting.
That's and many times executing for. So it's all of those. So the number one is at LA Comic-Con this year, for instance, we're going to take this author, we're creating an immersion booth of her world. So it's going to be really cool. We're going to have the entire universe and galaxy, and we're going to have people immersed, and we're going to have cosplay. It's going to be great. That's always my first priority. Do I want to take my client into a booth, into an experience, into an immersion? Secondly is I always want to get my clients on panels, because they are either experts in their fields, or they need to talk about what they're creating, what their IP is, that is their world that they've created. And it could be an old one or a new one. So for instance, we have, hopefully, cross our fingers, a 12 Monkeys, but then I'll be doing this as well. So that's the second one. The third is to make contacts. So at Dragon Con, I made contacts and developed some relationships with a publisher, a tabletop game developer, a really cool artistic dice creator. There's just very different connections depending upon what it is. At Dragon Con, it was all about gaming and cosplay contacts for me. I stumbled across 2 independent publishers, which I thought were very cool. But at San Diego, it's all about entertainment connections. So at San Diego, it was gaming, but it was high-level gaming development. It was Crunchyroll meetings. So it's more that. And then because the strike was on and it was a mess, because it had literally started 3 weeks before the SAG strike had, I spent a lot of time, and Justin, that's why I was so bummed. I spent a lot of time with artists. So Matt Wolf, who's an author who I just love. I spent a lot of time with authors, small press, and I just stop and I talk with everybody and I develop relationships.
Really cool, really cool. And before we move on back to Paul, I wanted to just ask, you're probably very in the know lately. Do you have any great recommendations? Say somebody's like, oh, I want to get into sci-fi, but I don't know where to start. What's out there? You know, books, games, movies.
Right.
What are your recommendations in this world that you're like, you better check out this?
Oh my God. Okay. Well, Dragon Steel Convention, which is Brandon Sanderson's, which I know he can be a touch point for people, but it's a crazy con, and it's worth going to. You know, in what I do in fandom development, there's like 8 touch points of where you can find fans. Cons are a big one, and fan fests that are local, I highly recommend that you check out if you're a sci-fi fantasy fan. Every single city, unless it's a village, has a fan fest or a con. Check it out, because they are amazing sources of finding new authors, of finding like-minded fans and communities. Secondly, Matt Wolf has an amazing fantasy series that you guys should check out. SG Blaze, The Last Luminian, that's the one I'm reading, has it's super cool sci-fi fantasy. It's not YA, it's a little bit above YA. I forget what that's called. I think it's called New Adult or something now in the publishing world, whatever. It's great. It's got a female protagonist. She's hilarious. SG, the author, she's great. She describes it as Star Wars books meets Princess Bride meets Lord of the Rings, which is pretty spot on. I would also say watch The Foundation. It is one of, I think, the best adaptations. I think it's one of the most well-written sci-fi pieces. It's beautifully shot. And then I would say Dune. Check it out. I know the first one's hard. I know we all joke about that, you know, you slept through it, but it is Denis has just an eye. Even if you never read if you never read Dune, if you're not into it, just watch it with the sound off. It is the most beautifully shot, amazing piece, and it's so worth watching if you are someone who wants to get into production, for cinematography, for how he literally places people in his shots, and what the juxtaposition behind and in front, and he uses mainly physical effects, which I think is fascinating. And then Ahsoka. I'm sorry, but
Sure.
oh wait, and for graphic novels, George Janti just came out with a Mandalorian series. It's really good.
Cool. Awesome.
Interesting.
There you go. Oh, back to you.
Okay, so my questions are a little more you based rather than what you do based. So have you ever had to say no to someone, or if someone comes to you, like one of your contributors comes to you and says, okay, here's what I came up with. Have you had to say no, or that's too much, or you could take back to the drawing board?
Yeah, quite a bit. I mean, it is part of what. So if you think about it as a producer, which is what I am, is that there are great ideas. And I genuinely do believe that there are no bad ideas. It's just that it may not be executable. It might not be viable. Sure. And it doesn't matter where the idea comes from. It could come from the creator themselves, where you have to say, that's amazing, but it doesn't fit the strategy that we've put up. And a lot of times what I have to do is, if it's a really good idea, I have to sit down and say, okay, I think we need to shift the strategy then, because that's a really good idea. That's not what we had on deck. How do we shift the strategy and the execution, of course, because you've already started production in one direction, then that can get really frustrating. But I think the one you have to say no to the most are the IP owners and distributors, because I hate to say this in a blanket way, but they still don't get it. I mean, the fact that I am still having conversations 20 some odd years later with IP distributors and owners and studios and production companies and saying, okay, hey, that's cool, but that is nothing about the world building for this particular IP. And I'm sorry, but the fans are going to eat you alive, or me, because I'm your front facing person. So that's where I probably say no the most. And you have to do it in a way, because these are people who genuinely are trying most of the time to do right by this IP. So what they're thinking is, we have to make money. I want to get butts in seats, or I want to get somebody to read this. We have to get people to purchase this. We want to have someone watch it on streaming, and we have to justify that we've just spent this money. That's not a bad reason, but you have to make sure that it's married correctly to the canon and to the content and to the fans.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. So looking at, as we talked about earlier, you've worked with a lot of properties. Has there been one that you haven't had the chance to work with, but if they called up right after we're done recording and say, hey, Jenny, we'd like you to work on fill in the blank, what would it be?
Lord of the Rings. Absolutely, Lord of the Rings. I mean, it is the holy grail for me that I've missed out on. But it would also, I would say, outside of that, I have not gotten to work with Marvel or DC properties. I was so close on DC properties twice, where we were in on amazing pitches. We've got the yes, and then it was no. And that one, the one that got the no, and it was in 2019, which, with COVID, it probably would have fallen apart anyway. But that one was to bring all of the Arrowverse and everything together with Jeff Johns and Jim Lee's ideas and what was happening at the time. That would have been amazing. And Marvel, just because I tend in general, even though I'm wearing Wonder Woman, I tend in general to be more of a Marvel fan. And then the other one, and I've been extremely lucky to work with Guillermo del Toro, but I would love to do an adaptation of BPRD. That would be amazing. I would just flip out. That would be, Hellboy is what it is, but I just think there's so much possibility there. And it has gotten so close to development so many times. I haven't been part of it, but friends who have worked with Dark Horse, and they're like, oh my God, we were this close. So. Okay.
And then this is my last question. So what would you call your ultimate fangirl moment? Like someone you got to meet, or some property that you got first glimpse of, like before anyone else knew about it. You don't have to name names, but if you did get to, like, you met an author, or you met a director or somebody, and you just like you had to keep yourself in check.
Okay. Can I tell two stories?
Oh, please. Yeah.
Okay. So the first one is Guillermo del Toro. So I got to work on The Strain. And when I worked on The Strain, what was amazing about it was it had been pitched to Fox, and Fox didn't get it. So he says certain words and says, okay, I'm going to go make a graphic novel to prove to you guys that this is worthwhile. And I was working with Dark Horse. He got to do that. And then I got to work on a project that was, again, this is how you tell stories outside of the narrative that's already been created. We got to create an entire story arc with him about the strain that was online that attracted people to both the books and the series. That was amazing. So we're at Comic-Con for the panel that I've put together, and I'm at the Hard Rock Hotel where all the talent is, and it was for a separate panel, and we get in the elevator and I'm with my husband, and Guillermo gets on. Now, he had just done The Shape of Water. I can't remember. He had just done something. And my husband is a huge fan, Pan's Labyrinth, the whole bit. And I never get this, because I love talking with people. They're just people. I got sweaty hands. He wasn't on the phone. He didn't have anybody with him. I could have said, oh my gosh, I'm the one. He had emailed with me. I had just finished it. I could have said nothing, went 10 floors, stopping at floors. He gets out. My husband turns to me and says, what is wrong with you? And I was just frozen. I was frozen. And it's because that's one of those moments where you don't think of them as a person. He was, creator. That's how I had him. And so that was that moment. The second one is I have had the most amazing fangirl moments with Lightstorm and Aliens. And I was lucky enough to be in meetings and have fun and hear where he was coming from and what he was doing and why he was doing the things he was doing. And then also to have meetings with the directors of the follow-on movies. And I got to work on those. And it was really, as a fan of the property and the world building, it was amazing to hear their thought processes. And it doesn't always make it to screen. And that was so cool to hear the arc, the storyline, the background, what they were really thinking, where some of those characters came from. And while some of them really didn't translate well, unfortunately, with Prometheus, and I loved working on those movies, knowing where they were coming from was amazing. And that was, as a sci-fi geek, as an aliens freak, that was an amazing moment. And sorry, one last one. I got to go to Lucasfilm and sit in a creator meeting, and it was really hard for me to keep my mouth shut, which respectfully you have to do, because when you're in the digital side, at that point I was doing an entire Star Wars arc to release the Blu-ray. And so we were there to gather all of the movies together, because Fox only owned Phantom Menace, and do everything with them. And they agreed, and we got to do everything. So we got to do the prequels, and we got to do the original 3, and the sequels hadn't come out yet. And then we got to do all the supplemental books. And then we got to establish what was canon, what was legacy, what was canon. Mm-hmm. So not me personally, that was Pablo, who had just been hired at the time. And he became head of their creative story group. And I got to watch from that moment of development of their creative story group, which is what Pablo's in charge of now, and what he helps run. And it was amazing. It was watching stories literally come to life at a table. We were there for, over a couple of months at different meetings. It was so cool.
And this was this the big house at the ranch?
I didn't get to go to the ranch, and I'm super bummed, because I'm actually from Marin County. So I was laughing because, it's called Lucas Valley, but it didn't have anything to do with him. It's from ranchers that I actually went to school with the family. We're super old generation farmers. And I never got to go to Skywalker Ranch. I got to go to the Presidio offices, and those were, and the museum is there. So I got to see the original Carbon. It was very cool. But I wanted to go to Skywalker Ranch, but at the time, because I was the digital creator and marketer, I wasn't high enough on the totem pole to get an invite. So
okay, wow, those are 3 absolutely great stories, and very fitting as well. Jenny, so where can people find out more about you and what you're doing online?
I don't have a website, because as a consultant, you tend to be more of a networker, but I'm on LinkedIn, and I always reply to everybody that touches base. I've got InMail, so it's open to anybody who wants to reach out to me. I'm JS, so 2 S's, JS Stiven on Instagram, Threads, and no, just that. And then Geek with Gray Hair on TikTok. And I'll be starting actually a series on TikTok with another friend of mine talking about 2 different things, talking about the history of digital and what we've been in from the beginning, and then also talking about fandom and where we think fandom is in this particular area in sci-fi fantasy. And we're going to be starting that the first week of October. And it's Geek with Gray Hair with an E. So gray, Grey.
Oh, okay.
I didn't realize
like Geek with a gray rabbit. That's what you had me going there for a second.
I know. That'd be funny.
Okay, excellent. Well, Jenny, this has been fascinating stuff and just really interesting because, this is something a lot of writers don't really think about because they're always like, oh, I want to, get my book written. I want to get my script produced, but they never really think about like what happens after that.
Right. And it's that relationship. It is for authors in particular. If you look at Facebook groups, but there are an enormous amount of people on Facebook that are authors who have developed amazingly deep relationships with their fandom, and it's brilliant.
You agree with that, Justin?
Yeah, of course.
As an author, with your own page.
Okay. Yeah. We'll get
I've been doing a lot. I could see how working with Jenny would definitely further my ability to interact with the audience, and that's always key, is having this audience interaction. You see, the authors that rise to the top are the ones that have the best engagement, and that's what all these big companies try to strive for as well. So
and guys, I get to have fun. If I wasn't having fun, then I certainly am not doing it right. So it's a blast. I'm lucky, and thank you. You guys are a lot of fun to talk to.
Okay, we're glad you enjoyed it. Jenny, this has been so much great information. Thank you so much for being here today.
Happy to.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's been great. And listeners, if you're interested in pursuing all that further, we'll include some links and information in the show notes, of course. And once again, if you could spread word about the show, audience, that'd be great. Reviews are always welcome. And this has been the Creative Writing Life Podcast. I'm Justin Sloan. You can find my books on Amazon.
And I'm Paul Zeidman. You can check out my screenwriting blog, Maximum Z, at maximumz.blog. I've got my books on Amazon as well. I'm also still on Twitter for the time being at Maximum_Z, and I'm on Instagram at Pez Screenwriting. Like you said, he's Justin. Jenny Stiven, thank you so much for being here today. I'm Paul. This has been the Creative Writing Life Podcast. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and most importantly, go write something.